strike and 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 strike until you have victory. For every enemy that is aligned against you, let there be that we would strike the ground, for you will give us victory, God. I hear a sound of abundance of rain. I hear a sound of victory. I hear a sound of shouting and singing. I hear a sound of victory. I hear a sound of abundance of rain. I hear a sound of victory. I hear a sound of abundance of rain. I hear a sound of victory.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just got back from the land of fire and ice, the home of the Vikings, the land where Odin trod, Iceland. This was one of the craziest trips I have ever been on. Some friends from high school bullied me into saying yes to this thing, and it materialized into one of the most incredible trips of my entire life. And part of the thing that made this trip so incredible is that we were largely a group of deconstructed and deconverted people hanging out in what is largely a post-Christian nation. And I want to talk about it.
And results would be the same.
So who's sucking the bananas?
That's like, that's up to you to decide. You
When,
gotta
my
pick that
girlfriend-
side.
So me and my friends flew into Reykjavik, and we rented a car, and we did the famous Ring Road tour. Iceland is a giant island, and we circumnavigated the entire island. We drove around the perimeter, and it was the most incredible, beautiful, dumbfounding, and expensive journey of my entire life. People don't know a whole lot about Iceland, but the one factoid that they usually know is this old urban legend, this old myth, that Iceland and Greenland had their names swapped, right? They called Iceland Greenland and Greenland Iceland. So Vikings, when they wanted to go like pillage and plunder and seize lands and territories, they would go to Greenland thinking it was the nice one, but in fact it's an icy hellhole. Let's just get this out of the way right now. Iceland, very icy. I have never been colder in my entire life. This is the first time I ever bought long johns or thermals or gloves. And even still, I was shivering the whole time. And nevertheless, every second of it was worth it. I thought that on this trip, I was gonna go because my friends bullied me into going. And I thought that I was just going to shiver and be miserable the whole time. But the country is so damn beautiful that you forget about how cold you are because you're just staring at these incredible landscapes and the horses and these mountains that just spring up out of nowhere and all of these snow-capped peaks. And it's disgustingly beautiful. Iceland is consistently rated as having one of the highest qualities of life anywhere on Earth. They got social programs out the wazoo, their median wage is quite high, and most of all, they have one of the lowest crime rates of anywhere in the world. What's also fascinating is that Iceland, as a nation, is a Lutheran country. However, that's a longer and more complicated story that I'll flesh out later in this video. Iceland as a nation only has about 400,000 people, but every year they get as many as 2 million tourists. And as my friends and I were traveling around the country, every Icelander that we spoke to was kind and gracious. On average, they tend to be a little bit more reserved, a little bit more modest. They're kind of the opposite of me, the loud, boisterous, obnoxious, quintessential American. And Iceland isn't only beautiful for what you see, it's beautiful for what you don't see. You don't see messy and chaotic billboards ruining the landscape. You don't see litter anywhere on the entire island. And you don't see gaudy, lavish displays of wealth and affluence scattered throughout the country. You just see these nature landscapes that feel like something out of a storybook. But so, in addition to viewing these incredible landscapes, we dressed up as Vikings. We ate some incredibly good food. I ate shark for the first time. That was weird. We visited hot springs. We swam in lagoons. We sprinted through the snow to catch the northern lights. And we stuffed ourselves in our little SUV and drove around the island blasting Ram Ranch because that's what you do when you're 30 and stupid.
You see the Dunkin' Donuts around here? I'm fucking fiending, man. I need some Dunkin'.
And I fell in love with my friends all over again. But this trip was not just to catch up with my old high school pals that I love dearly. it was also to explore the religion of Iceland. Now, I've already decided that for this video, I'm not going to do the thing where I just kind of like, bashfully say like, I think this is how you pronounce this really difficult to say Icelandic word. I'm just going to butcher it, and you're going to know that I'm butchering it. And we're both going to know that I don't know how to pronounce these words. How do you pronounce this word? Yeah, I don't know either. So I'm just going to say it confidently and not apologize for it. And you'll just have to keep in the back of your mind that I'm an idiot. Like I said, Iceland is now a Lutheran nation. However, that was not always the case. So Iceland is the land of the Vikings, and when the Vikings came to settle in Iceland, they brought with it the Norse pagan religion, and they were worshiping gods like Odin and Thor and Freyr. And then, around the year 1000 AD, there was a dramatic shift, and Iceland, against all odds, became a Christian nation. While I was traveling with my friend group, we were near Diamond Beach, and one of the cool things that we did was we went ice caving, and it was crazy. You basically take a monster truck out into the ice glacier fields, and you put on crampons and walk around the ice and see this stunning blue glacier water, frozen as hard as a rock. And while we were exploring these ice caves, our guide let me ask him a whole bunch of questions about religion, kind of, there at the back of the group. And he told me the story, and I later Googled to make sure he was right, about how the religious fate of Iceland was determined by one man. Thorgeir was a pagan chieftain, and when Iceland was on the brink of civil war, with Norway's Christian king breathing down Iceland's neck, pressuring them to convert to Christianity, according to legend, the entire matter was thrown at Thorgeir's feet, and he was asked to settle the matter and decide whether Iceland should become a Christian religion or remain a pagan one. And again, according to legend, Thorgeir hid himself under a cloak for an entire day and an entire night, trying to determine the future of Iceland's religious affiliation. And after all of that time, meditating and thinking, he came out with a definitive decision. Iceland would be a Christian nation. It would formally adopt Christianity and the Trinity. Christ and the God of the Bible would be the God of Iceland. And yet Thorgeir made a concession that in private, the Old Norse gods would be allowed to be worshipped privately in people's homes. And as I was talking to my tour guide about this, he told me this story with such passion. And he was explaining that story, that ethos, continues in Iceland to today. It is largely a history of tolerance and being really chill. So, as is my custom, I went to church a couple of times while I was in Iceland. The first church that I went to is basically the main church in Iceland, Hallgrímskirkja. And I call it the main church in Iceland because, one, it is one of the Lutheran state churches, and two, it's just the most iconic church in all of Iceland. This church is absolutely dumbfounding. On first glance, it looks like a giant rocket ship, but then as you get closer, you realize that the entire church is made to look like the hexagonal basalt columns that you see in Iceland's lava fields. It is the most wild and beautiful exterior to a church that I've seen in a long time. Inside the church, there's a really crazy and ornate organ. There's some beautiful stained glass, and there is the best view of the entire city. You can, pay a few ISK and take an elevator to the top and maybe get your eardrums shattered by the ringing bell at the top. And you can get some gorgeous, gorgeous pictures and videos through the windows there. If I'm honest, I wasn't really interested in going to a Sunday service at Hallgrímskirkja, but instead I got to go to a little prayer meeting. And this was so sweet and gracious. It was one of the pastors and two women. And so as dozens of busy tourists were, flooding the aisles and walking in and out and taking pictures, off to the side next to a small altar were these three women praying the Lord's Prayer in Icelandic.
What?
No, all right. I know that sounds bad.
And I kind of sat and listened and just kind of was a fly on the wall there. And it was just beautiful. The pastor was Icelandic, one woman was German, and the other woman was Vietnamese. And I think it just struck me how modest it was and how it wasn't trying to draw unnecessary attention to itself. You know, there was probably 30 people in that room and only 3 of them were praying, and the pastor wasn't upset by that. You know, she didn't feel the need to, you know, get more numbers. The people who were there needed it, and she supplied that need. Now, I should pause here and talk about Iceland's current religious status. Iceland is still, to this day, on paper, a Lutheran country. And Iceland isn't a wildly diverse place, and it's not wildly diverse with regards to its religiosity either. But there are still Muslims on the island. There are still Mormons. There are still Pentecostals and other small sects and religions as well. They're a little farther and fewer in between, but they're allowed to be there on the island and worship however they see fit. One unique honorable mention there is the religion of Ásatrú. And I was so bummed that I didn't get to go and, you know, have the proper Ásatrú experience, but there's always next time. Ásatrú is a pagan revivalist movement. On record, it has about 6,000 members, and they are trying to slowly but surely revitalize Old Norse mythology. And so a little more than 1% of Iceland's population is engaging in these rituals and ancient practices and prayers, with kind of a caveat. Ásatrú has with it kind of this political undercurrent as well, where by marking yourself as a member of Ásatrú, you're kind of sticking it to the man a little bit and kicking back against the Icelandic Lutheran Church. But then beyond that, Ásatrú is not a dogmatic religion. Sort of similar to Gnostic revivalist movements, dogma is not central. It's sort of sniff it out and feel what feels right and figure out your own prayers and rituals and which gods you want to pray to. They don't have a hard canon of scriptures and not scriptures, but they have a series of ancient poems and texts and lores and mythologies that are central, but not really in or out with regards to a canon. And like Iceland's Christianity, Iceland's modern paganism tends to be a very personal endeavor. So me and my friends made our way all around the perimeter of Iceland. We stayed in incredible hotels. We went to a gaggle of different lagoons. We went drinking, we went clubbing. We saw waterfalls and geysers and hot springs. And then we ended up back at Reykjavik. And then we went to the world's only penis museum. That was interesting. That was not on my bingo card for life. But yeah, it was like a $30 museum. It was worth it. Gave me more of an appreciation for my little guy, you know? I call it little because they had preserved whale penises there in the museum, and you can't feel too good about yourself after that. And then back in Reykjavik, I went to one last church. Háteigskirkja is a smaller church, maybe a kilometer away from the big church downtown in the city. But I think I liked it substantially better. The architecture everywhere in Iceland is just so stunning. They've so meticulously mastered the art of architecture and making buildings feel like they blend in with their environments and with their landscapes. The church had these really unique bell towers on either side of it. And then when you go inside, it's so surreal. Like it was one of the most otherworldly churches I've ever been in. It had these really unusual and incredibly stylistic golden columns throughout the church. And then on the ceilings, I don't know how to describe it in architectural terms, but the ceiling looked like the underbelly of a ship. It looked like the spine of a ship. And I have to wonder if that's a theological homage to the idea that the church is the modern ark protecting believers from the storms of the world outside. And then behind the pulpit and behind the altar was this stunning, beautiful cross mosaic with all of these vivid blues and golds and yellows and reds. And so I stumbled my way in and sat in the very last pew in the back, listened to the beautiful organ music and the incredible choir, and then I listened to the sermon, which I didn't understand at all because it was all in Icelandic. And I feel like that was okay. I don't think I needed to know what the sermon was about. Sometimes in being in other contexts like this, I think I just appreciate more being struck by how wide-reaching and how resounding the sound of Christianity in other places is. Remembering that these stories have, struck the ears of people all over the world, not just people who look like me or who come from where I come from. And then after the service, I walked up to the pastor. I believe his name was Johannes, and I told him, like, hey, I'm studying theology, or rather, I studied theology. And he was so gracious, and he, brought me up by the altar, and he was like, come, let's talk. And I just asked him about the difference between religion in America and religion in Iceland. And he was just gracious, and, he talked about how he was a professor at the local university teaching Old Testament, and how, the Icelandic people were proud of their Lutheran heritage in their church. And I told him a little bit about my background of growing up Pentecostal and being a former street preacher. And he smiled and he nodded. And he said something along the lines of, yeah, we don't have that kind of fervor here. And so while I was standing on street benches and, yelling at passersby, the kids in this church were, given this very gentle, soft version of Christianity. And throughout the island, religion is just a much more tempered force. It's not to say that it's not sincere. It's not to say that it's not genuine. But all of the huffing and puffing and, striving that I went through, that's not really a thing there. I'm sure it is in some pockets, like Pentecostal Icelanders exist, but it's just not the general milieu or the general flavor of that country. And for a lot of Icelanders, they've entirely parted ways with religion. Some have done so explicitly. Iceland has one of the largest populations of atheists per capita anywhere in the world. Others have done so, kind of quietly. They'll still claim the status of Christian on paper or on their government census, but consistently Iceland has one of the lowest rates of prayer and church attendance anywhere in the world. And in spite of that, they're doing okay. It was such a trip, traveling with this group of friends, man. A couple of them are Liberty grads, and they bullied us into watching the Jerry Falwell Jr. documentary about the pool boy, and they were there for all of that. All of that insanity. For those who don't know, Jerry Falwell Jr., the president of Liberty University, the largest Christian university in the world, he and his wife were actively engaged in a cuckold where the president's wife would have sex with the pool boy, and the husband would watch, usually from the closet. Teach their own, man, but it's not really kosher when you're, also screaming about the LGBTQ community taking over. But one of our friends there was never religious. He just kind of was raised secular and is kind of an agnostic and just doesn't really get religion. And so during one of these long car rides, he was like, yeah, explain it to me. Explain the thought process to me. And I was like, okay, I'm going to think out loud as a young, zealous Pentecostal for the next 60 seconds. Okay, I'm with 4 friends driving through Iceland. I'm looking out the window thinking about how every stone of this landscape was painted by the brush of an incredible creator. Each one of my 4 friends in this car is made in the image and likeness of God, and they have incomprehensible worth, and they will spend eternity either in God's blissful heavenly presence or his hellish, insufferable wrath. And anything I say has the potential to bring them closer or further away from that vengeance. The pastor at the last church, he looked at me and he said, I don't think that they're going to hell. It was just kind of like an off-the-cuff remark. Yeah, I don't think that. And he even gave a biblical justification for it. And truthfully, I used to be scared of people like him. I used to be scared of people like me. My biggest fear growing up was becoming the person that I have now become. I was petrified and horrified of falling away, and I would have screaming fits and tantrums, worrying and fretting about the idea of someday becoming an atheist. And sometimes I talk to people who have that same fear. Sometimes it's believers, sometimes it's ex-believers, and sometimes it's people who are figuring out what to believe. I met with a fan and grabbed coffee a couple months ago, and it was such a sweet and gracious encounter. And if you guys watch my crap, like, you know that my MO is not to try to deconvert people or get them to question or leave their faith. But they were going through it, and they were really wrestling, and, you know, they didn't know who they would be on the other side of things if they decided to leave. And they told me about some of their incredible acts of generosity and kindness, and they just wanted to know if they would be okay afterwards. My lovely editor Jake has a song called Foxhole.
I'm not the same as I'm not loved, but I know there's no unbelievers in a foxhole.
Jake's a super talented musician, and I unironically love and listen to his music a lot. And he's got this line in this song Foxhole where he says, "I don't know who I'd be if I didn't believe." And that's the question that this young person was asking as well, if they would be okay. Driving around with my friends, you know, I got to experience so much with them that you don't feel like you should be allowed to experience something that beautiful. Or that wonderful. And looking at Iceland and the people there, you know, where religion is still in some sense central to who they are and what they are, and yet it's not the driving force of their nation anymore. They're still good. I know that some people will perk up and say, like, Iceland's stability and its goodness, it was purchased with Christian capital. And maybe. I don't even know that I would contest that. But now, in one of the least religious countries in the world, they're doing fine. They haven't imploded. And I'm not propping them up as, you know, some great godless utopia. And I certainly wouldn't say that they're great because of their atheism, but I think that they're an interesting case study because I think they're genuinely good, and I think they're genuinely doing well, in spite of not having God at the helm. And yet they don't have spite or resentment for the people who came before them, for the faith that so many of their ancestors and forefathers believed in. And they can sing hymns in the churches and see elves in the trees and not feel resentment towards them. I've seen apologists and religious people of all stripes do some occasional fear-mongering, hinting that if you leave God or you leave your faith, that, you know, you're destined to become a despot, or you're destined to leave your family or cheat on your wife, or and I don't think that's true. There's no rule in the sky that says that you have to be this or that type of person after you deconvert or deconstruct. You can live the kind of life that you still want to live, even after deconversion. You can still be the kind of person that you like, the kind of person that you want to be. And so for any of my questioning or doubting friends who are wondering if you'll be okay on the other side of a deconstruction or a deconversion, I think you can be.